Misha, I'll just tell you a funny story. Misha always wanted to be a doctor, but he wanted to be a veterinarian first. And then he applied and got into the best veterinarian school in the US. And after he got accepted, he found out that he's allergic to all of the animals. So he chose to cure people instead.
So, and funnily enough, actually, the whole introduction is going to tie very, very closely into the presentation. So what happened is I was extremely allergic to dogs and cats, and somewhere half through the medical school, I stumbled upon a guy in New York who basically diagnosed me with mercury poisoning from all the silver fillings I had. You know, we're all, well, he's an exception. He has perfect teeth. I don't know how he did this, but, you know, growing up in Moscow in 80s, I had, by the time I immigrated to Israel for a few years, I had 14 silver fillings. And the first one was put in when I was 10. So by the time I was 25, I had 14 fillings. So let's table that, and you'll see how that ties into the whole talk later on. Okay? So I told Paulina, I give this talk with closed eyes. I probably did it over 100 times by now. So there are only two things that I'll tell you to be patient. Sometimes I curse because I'm very upset at the state of affairs of our current healthcare system. If I speed up, slow me down, okay? Because I tend to sometimes run a little fast. Okay, so what I'll tell you today is probably new for most of you. It's going to look a little academic just because that's what I do. I mean, I give this talk primarily to academicians, physicians, other healthcare providers. You all up here are pretty smart. It's Boston. Harvard is a couple of blocks away, or MIT, whatever. So I assume you guys can follow through. Okay, I got some disclosures or whatever. Okay, so what we're going to talk about. So I'll give you some basic overview of what I've been working on, both as title of the book, to Integrated Geriatrics. If you're interested, it's over there. You can buy them on. We're going to basically go over basic screw-up situations in terms of how we age in this country and how we should truly age. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about blue zones. Who here has ever heard this? Okay, so a couple of you. So that's good. If everybody heard it, would have been more. And then I'll tell you sort of what we're clinically doing, which is pretty fascinating, since now we have multiple cases of reversed Alzheimer's disease, even in the case of advanced Alzheimer's disease being reversed. And this is actual information, and I'll show you evidence and data that's been published already. So, let's keep all that. Okay, so some terms, because it's kind of fascinating. This is not a joke, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so this is the real science. It's been promoted heavily, specifically in Europe, and I was fired from Russian geriatric Facebook page when I said that they are crazy, but you know, they fired me. So there's a whole bunch of Russians in Russia who follow this guy. I'll show you his story in a second. Who believe that in our lifespan this is possible. I don't think it is, but nonetheless. So, but these other terms are quite important. So anti-aging is what you often see here in America. This is a more or less American term. And there's a whole society of anti-aging. It's called, there's actually several anti-aging. There's Restorative Medicine Association. There's this, what they call A4M, anti-aging for you medicine. And there's this whole idea of regenerative medicine, which has more to do with not reversing the age, but to regenerate tissues that are losing their function. Of course, this is what I do. So my standard academic appointment at George Washington University is in geriatrics and palliative care, and those are my actual specialties. So I have 4 boards. So I'm boarded in internal medicine, geriatrics, palliative, and integrative medicine. So I feel like all I'm doing, I'm paying somebody else's board to maintain my certification. medication, so I made the executive decisions last year to stop paying internal medicine because it's a lot of money. This is science of how to age well. This is science of how not to age. So I don't believe in that. So these things are, I think, you can discuss whether or not they're actual reality or whether they are kind of terms that are currently advertised but not necessarily realistic. And this is just my definition, and this is what we're going to talk today about. So, and the idea is I just wanted to give a term that will sort of encompass the sense that we can't really avoid aging, but can we figure out how to age the best? And more importantly, can we actually separate from this? So everybody familiar with the term, the problem is this is medical term. So geriatrics means literally medical care of an older person who has a sickness. That's what the term means. The problem is that, that's not necessarily how, especially the baby boomers want to think. They want to stay healthy. And that term doesn't help you with that. In fact, if you get anything out of this lecture, I hope you'll realize you really cannot rely on the current healthcare system if you want to live long and healthy, because it will actually probably going to make you sicker than keeping you healthy. Because the tools within the healthcare system, unfortunately for most of it, is not designed appropriately to maintain health. They're designed to reverse acute medical problems, and they're designed for the business of healthcare system. And the business of healthcare system is not necessarily putting you first. And that's when I'm going to curse as time comes. So, as I mentioned, there's a whole... Oh, that's not enough. I don't know why it's not really... Oh, well. So this guy is quite famous. He's a very senior professor in Canada. So literally they're asking this question, is the aging actual disease, and what should we do about it? And there's a whole slew of experts believe that to be true. I hope what you get out of my point is, no, aging is not a disease, but a lot of diseases are age associated. And those are the diseases we have to work on how to prevent, and if they do occur, how to treat them. And then I promised you to tell you about this guy. So, and every degree, I have never personally met him, but I know people who did, and they divided rapidly into categories. One group thinks that he's genius, another thinks that he's a totally paranoid schizophrenic, and everything he says should be taken accordingly with a serious consideration. I think the reality is probably, as usually, somewhere in between, a little bit of both. He inherited a good amount of money, and he's got multiple multi-million-dollar grants to literally study immortality. So he's kind of the head of this whole immortality science camp. There are a lot of people that think that he's a prodigy and that he will indeed lead us to finding of immortality. You guys can decide for yourself whether you're going to believe in this. But bottom line, they're literally working on the methods on how to design cells to live forever and not cancer cells. They also literally working on how do you rejuvenate tissues from being old and sick to being young. And, that's all I'm going to say about that. But this is an important concept. So now this is directly taken from the book. There's multiple different theories of why we age. All of them are actually, except for social functional isolations theory, they're not truly clinical, although each one of them, whether it's free radical, mitochondrial, neuroendocrine, or glycosylation or cross-linking theory, they do have applications to the clinical practice, but we just don't know how to simply do something to stop the process and show the benefit of it. So for example, I can give someone tons of free radical scavengers or antioxidants, and you probably all know what the answer would be, and nothing happens. In fact, some of them are accelerating aging, not slowing it down. So we don't know why would that be the case. Currently, this is probably the hottest topic in our field, because this is, everybody familiar with what mitochondria is? Do I need to explain? Okay, so mitochondria, for those of you who are up front, it's a little kind of a, you know what cells are? We all made out of cells? Okay. So inside of our cells, there's a little energy factor called mitochondria. They're actually thought to be prehistoric cells that somehow ended up in our own cells. So they're only teeny tiny cells, but they're making energy for our body. And so when mitochondria stops working effectively, we start dropping our energy production. And the idea is that that generates entire metabolic slowing down, which leads to a variety of different negative impacts, such as change in the sugar metabolism, accumulations of free radicals that cannot be scavenged, because part of the mitochondrial function is creating of the balance between pro-oxidative stress and clearing of the junk. And the oxidative stress, what's the best way? I'm a teacher first and foremost. What's the best way to generate, the healthiest ways to generate free radical
Go for
challenges? Go for a run, absolutely. So exercise is the cleanest, the best, and the most proven to be beneficial way of, and frankly, in terms of human lives, if you're a Drosophila or your standard worm in the ground, one of the best ways for us to live long is to cut our calories by 30%. But if for humans, actually exercise is the only thing that's actually been definitively proven to prolong life. We just talked about with Masha and Fima before we started, sort of, if we cut human calories, are we going to live longer? The data is no, absolutely not. Maybe intermittent fasting, but not caloric restrictions. And then, of course, this is it's not actually a theory. I would say it's a clinical practice application. Inflammation is a big challenge in our current society. This term is coined very appropriately, and I think it's a very important term. And this is the part of the, we're an area of biotech, Silicon Valley, right? So there's a lot of biotech interest in this, because if you can slow down inflammation generation factors, you probably can slow down the aging. But that's a theoretical. What we do know in clinical practice, people with a chronic inflammatory states, whether it's autoimmune conditions or cancers or any neurodegenerative conditions, they're all actually inflammatory states. We know that they can be treated with anti-inflammatory tools. So I would say this is not a theory, this is actual fact. Well, we don't know how this plays into the rest of this system. Now, but the bigger social question, why do we need to age, is never been answered. So it's a very fascinating, both ethical, philosophical, and medical question, triple one, right? And we age very differently. So this is sort of what we don't want to look like. This is just a regular nursing home. This is what we do want to look like. This gentleman is 102, still tends to his fields and fully this was a while ago, so I don't know if he's still alive. But that's a actual life 102 cutting the, I don't know what is he cutting, but something. So that's how we should be aging. Now, this is an exceptional case. Anybody knows what this is? It's a fascinating story. So Olga, Ukrainian actually, so she passed away at the age of 96, but before she passed, she became the most ever decorated athlete in the world, and she's the fastest human being on the planet. Chew this for a second. She's faster than Usain Bolt. Much, like by 20% faster.
What do you mean, like Sharon?
Yeah, her 100 feet or 100 meter, what was that? She's the fastest human being on Earth, and she became the fastest at 89.
What does it mean?
I just want to check to make sure people are not sleeping. Well, of course that's not real, but if you take the coefficient of her age and sex, she's the fastest human being ever reported. She started exercising at the age of 75. She had a very difficult life. When she was around her 30s or 40s, she had an abusive relationship with her husband. She had a couple of kids, tried to sort of left the husband, worked a bunch of jobs. And then so kids and grandkids grew up. In mid-70s, one of her girlfriends took her to the track and said, now we're gonna run. And she liked it. And she never exercised a day in her life, this woman, ever. And suddenly, like, she found herself being an elite athlete because she really liked it. By age of late 70s, she had a bunch of trainers and she was participating in every Olympic event. And there's a whole book written about her life, and it's called What Makes All Go Wrong. And I highly, if anybody interested in a sort of a weird case life, is there a life after 75? This is a great book to read about her life. And she beat like pretty much every world record known for her age and for her sex. So she's a remarkable human being. This is my inspiration. That's my own father. I'm not that tall. You don't see it, but he's not that short. I'm on the rollerblades because he can do the full marathon. I've done it once, and I'll tell you never again. But so I've done half marathon, and then I put rollerblades and go meet him. So he took second place in Philadelphia Marathon here, obviously in his age group. But this is he was 80 there in this picture. So this is first year when he went from one age group to another one. So the competition went from something like 10-1 to like 3-1. So he was second. Yeah, and then, well, he's 83 now. So we'll see what happens this year. Okay, so let's shift a little bit. So we suck. We're terrible. We're the worst country in terms of health and longevity in the entire developed world by much. So this is Japan. So look at this difference. This is probably should update the slide. So it's actually not any different. It's worse now. So, huh? Yeah, well,
Developed.
I said developed. You're not paying attention to what I'm saying. So they're now Korea. If you put Korean women here, they're over 85 by now, and we're actually now in the last 2 years reversed
down, right?
progress. That's right. So we're going down now.
So this is predicted, or
No, this is real. Nothing predicted. This is real. This is past. This is 2006.
so somebody was born in 2006, or somebody died?
No, this is life expectancy at birth in years reported for this date. So if you're born, oh yeah, you're right. So if you're born in 2006, you expected to live till, on average, what does it say there? Oh, here's Russian Federation. By the way. Oh, that's not that bad. I thought it would be a lot much worse. Where's America? Oh, here. So that would be predicted. That's a future. This is the real. They don't even put Russia because that would be pathetic. It would be like here. There's no graph for that. Yeah. So anyway, it's more than 5 years different from advanced countries.
But you don't have other large populated countries on this list.
Well, this is only developed. This is the leading developed nations in terms of the healthcare expense per dollar per person per developed country. So, like Japan is up front now. Interesting, Korea is catching up, and actually nothing changes in a couple of years. Korea will be better. It'll be on top average between both men and women. Women already live longer in Korea than in Japan.
Did you say it's amount of expense per person?
No, that's just how a WHO decides which healthcare systems are top 10, let's say, or top 20. In terms of, they take expense into account, and then they figure out how much you spend per person. So that's one ranking. Another ranking is literal outcomes. Mm-hmm. So we're ranked in the mid-30s, somewhere between Costa Rica. We're just above Costa Rica. That's 2 years ago. I may be a little outdated. So we're just above Costa Rica and just below Croatia in terms of outcomes, general average compounded. But this is just the leading developed nations, and we lost in that. And that's, by the way, best case scenario. So the real case scenario currently is exactly what you were saying. So last couple of years, so 2014, 15, 16, I don't have the 17 and 18, is that, and actually no, 17, 18, this trend continues. It's just not on the graph. We're losing a little bit. We're continuously starting to live less. It's a very small difference, it's like decimals, but nonetheless, it's sort of consistent. So why that happens? So well, government tells us this. You can't really see this. You probably need to improve the slide. So this is the injuries that are on the rise, and that's actually related to the opioid crisis. I'll tell you, this is a selling bullshit. This is a total fucking lie, and there's absolutely nothing true about it. And the reality is what they really are, they're representing is this. So this is Alzheimer's disease. So if I tell you that Alzheimer's is the most expensive disease in the world, then actually #1 leading cause of death. So basically what we're not seeing this. If you die in a hospital, let's say you're 95 and you have Alzheimer's disease, but you die from pneumonia because you went to the hospital with pneumonia and you never come out. They're going to report this as you died from pneumonia. But guess what? You would have not gotten and died from pneumonia if you wouldn't have Alzheimer's. And that's never reported. This is the actual death rate where Alzheimer's is written on a death certificate as the main cause of death. That's exceedingly unusual because there's other deaths that people die from usually. Whether it's heart disease, you have a heart attack or pneumonia or stroke, or you fell over, hit your head and died right there on the spot. None of this would be over a non-intentional injury, but that's a problem. So this is a huge contributor that's heavily underrepresented. And I will tell you that all these chronic diseases, Alzheimer's and cancers, is what's gradually dragging the life expectancy down. And if you never ask yourself this question, sort of, well, most of you here, many of you here, are in your 30s and 40s, right? And so, you probably never thought of it. So what am I going to do in 20, 30 years? Well, here's what I'll tell you. If you get anything out of this lecture in terms of for yourself, you have to ask yourself this question now. How do you want to age, and what are you expecting when you turn 70, 60, 70, and 80? What's important for you? And, you don't want to think about this. I don't want to think about this, but if you don't think about this now, I'll tell you, the reality will be pretty sad. Your reality will be likely, or very good likelihood of this. Not that, not this, not that, but this. Why? That's the next piece of the puzzle. So this is the next piece of the puzzle. Why do we do so terrible? Look at this. This is a 3+ chronic conditions when you're 65. That's a definition of older. And if you look at the statistics, 42% of all Americans over 65 are going to have 3 or more chronic medical problems. There's a French who smoke, fuck whatever moves, drink whatever the hell they want, and they don't get sick, right? So here, American government that tells us not to smoke, not to fuck whatever moves, not to drink alcohol, and we die quickly because we're sick.
Because we don't do that.
No.
Okay, well, now that's a classic case of
Correlation.
Correlation is not causation, so go back to the college to learn statistics 101 kind of thing. But it's entertaining, right? Because, what the hell?
What are the typical conditions?
Well, that's a good question. So, typical conditions, if you go back.
What about diagnostics?
Yeah, that's a typical, obesity, hypertension, diabetes. Whatever you think that will end up eventually being the end point on this table. Heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, stroke. Well, diabetes is listed here.
Yeah, but they're all kind of metabolic diseases.
Yeah, exactly. They're all metabolic diseases. So if you think about this, so how is that then they don't have any metabolic diseases? What are the answers?
Maybe they just die early.
Maybe the white colonization.
Who said that? No. Who said about dying early? Okay, that's a great thought. That actually should give you an A as a student, except then you're going to get F or D for not paying attention to anything, because over here it's pretty clear they are in yellow, And they're way above us, and they're third in the world.
They move a lot.
But good thought. They move a lot.
They
That's true.
smoke.
They don't eat
This-
food as much.
Stress. They don't.
Right. No, portions, that's not true. They eat just as much as we do. They eat different food.
Less sugar.
They eat less sugar, they eat a lot more fat. They eat very fatty foods, right? They eat a lot of fat.
So
They
basically,
eat a lot slower. They have a lot less stress and they move a lot.
insulin resistance.
I think the US has more diagnosed diseases because it makes more money.
Okay, well that earns you not only A for like good thinking, but that's actually beyond that. That's like a fellowship level A. Yeah, that's actually completely true. And I will show you why it's completely true. And that leads us to the next huge point. So what do we do with this? What do you think we do with this? Do we prescribe exercise and stress reduction?
Pills.
That's exactly right.
Statins.
So if you're 65 plus, 36% of us taking five drugs or more. Now look at the comparison at other ages. So 5 more drugs if you're 0 to 11, with less than 1%. And it stays less than 1% until you start getting mid-age. That's what we do. Not only are we having all these problems because whatever the cultural reasons are, it's a whole separate lecture. But then what do we do with it? We over-medicate it. So we come up with a name for something because we can sell a fucking pill for it. And that generates this. So the real fourth cause of death, if I go back and show you what the causes of death, government never reports this. It's the fucking pills that kill us. It's 100 nowadays, that's 2014. Now it's almost 150,000 last year. And that's a conservative estimate. This is a very conservative estimate. This is an official conservative estimate. Because this estimate depends on the
So
report.
just overdose or.
No. This is correctly prescribed medications that are causing known death causes of death. Like, let's say.
As a side effect.
Yeah, no. It's a possible side effect that you explain to the patient that when you start this medication may happen to you. It's a low risk, it will treat your condition, but there is this, it's when you're looking at the commercial, right? You have that little thing running at the bottom, and then they rapidly tell you at the end, and it costs this. Well, guess what? It's real. There is some chances of this, and because we're over-medicalizing flu, for which we will give Tylenol. So if I give you a list of 5 things, heroin. Well, nobody knows ketamine, so it's just online. Ketamine is old. We've been all over the news. Okay, so let's do more. Let's do 6. So heroin, Tylenol, Motrin, coffee.
What?
Coffee.
Coffee?
Coffee is a drug. Caffeine is a drug. Right? Cannabis. And let's pick something else. And let's pick cocaine. Which is the safest drug? They're all drugs.
Cannabis.
All right. So who said cannabis? All right. So you earn a star.
Poison.
So coffee would be second safest. Tylenol would be third safest. Motrin would be fourth. Cocaine would be 1 before last, and heroin would be last. Right, so the cannabis would be by far the safest. Right? Probably cannabis is safer than potatoes. But that's for another conversation.
So Motrin is safer than Tylenol?
No,
Yes. No, Tylenol is safer than Motrin, but not by much. So you have about 1,000 deaths from Motrin per year and about 700 from Tylenol. And there's never been a single case of cannabis mortality reported in the entire human being evolution.
People die from coffee.
Yeah, a couple of people die from caffeine every year. Easily. If you have
Coffee or
no, we're not talking about overdose, by the way. We're talking about the regular intake. We're not talking about overdose at all. We're talking about the regular intake. You can die if you have a specific cardiac abnormality. You can die from an even low dose of caffeine. So.
There are increases in problems with cannabis with the others, right? Or if I got it wrong.
Yeah, but they're not going to kill you. They can kill you if you get so intoxicated, you're going to walk out of the window. But that's not direct cause of death. That's an accident related to the. I'm talking about the direct mortality from the substance. If I tie you to a bed and feed you 100 pills of Tylenol and don't treat you, you're going to die, right? So if I give you 10 grams of THC, nothing's going to happen to you. Well, you will trip for a while, but eventually you'll think you're dead. Well, what happens, you'll think you're dead, you'll call yourself dead, and then you won't be. And that's a real story. I had a attending once call me 10 o'clock at night from ER saying, we have your patient who says she's dead. I'm like, she's saying she's dead, she's not dead, right? He's like, and there's like whole back of the ER laughing. And they're like, oh yeah, Dr. Kogan's patient. I'm like, just come on, hang out, hydrate, send the hell out of home, and don't call me at 10 o'clock at night. She forgot to mix her bottle, so she got to the bottom of her tincture, and it was just unintended overdose from concentrated stuff at the bottom. So I always tell patients, mix your substance. Mix your weed. So when I'm in a hospital on my geriatric or palliative service, this is how I feel. Like I'm mapping the floor. I'm like trying to stabilize my older patients, and yet like I'm looking at this constantly, and I know where I can just turn off this faucet if the system allows me, but I can't, because all this comorbidities and complications, half of them literally, often, we incur. All right, so this is sort of the model that I came up writing the book. So there's a lot of words here that probably, if you're not in the healthcare system, mean very little to you, like whole person, patient center. Those are just the things that are getting paid right now. Like if I take this motto to Medicaid, which I'm doing in the DC area, they're actually going to grant us to, for example, start acupuncture for people, because acupuncture is not covered, so as an example. And the idea is that we really apply first lifestyle interventions and non-pharmacological treatment before you get to use your pharmacological interventions. And you do this as a standard of care. Now, if I take this model to Wall Street, you can imagine what will happen to me. First of all, not much. Second, they'll probably shoot me in the head in the back of the alley because, that means that a lot of people will lose a lot of money. So what does this really look like? What it really looks like is this. So if you, anybody have a backyard growing plants in the backyard? Yeah. So like we know, we're not gonna, we're trying to grow a peach tree, if the branch starts to get sick, we're not going to sort of go in there and do something to the branch. We may, but we're going to immediately think there's something wrong with the system, right? With what it's getting, with the food, with the water. So how is that we are somewhat different? We're not. This is, can we lift it up just a moment? So there's a whole spectrum of issues that if you look at this, and I'm going to leave this slide for a minute. Think about this. Think about your life. Like, what is in your roots that you know for a fact is not fully addressed? If you were to read all this and you think, what am I missing? Or what would I like to see more of in my life? Am I moving enough? Is my sleep good enough? Am I getting enough nutrients? Is my environment safe? Now, you guys are in a much safer place than where I live. I live in the DC area where there's tons of molded houses. So, 5 to 10% of everything I do is the mold detox. This is a huge problem, and it's rapidly increasing because of new building materials. Right? So the brand new materials, especially the drywalls, if the moisture gets in there, that's it. It's all mold if you don't clean it and dry it in 24 hours. So we're starting to see a lot more illnesses related to this. And in about whenever we get there, I'll show you it's even scarier than it looks. Like you all heard about the Michigan story, right? The Flint. That's the tip of an iceberg. It's already happening in every large city. And if you think that your water is safe, check it. I would never trust the government. So we thought that when we left Russia, we could trust the American government. I'm not asking. I'm not complaining. I'm seeing the reality of when patients come to me with the problems that haven't been addressed. So I'm very practical at all this. This doesn't come out of me being a researcher. It comes out of me being a physician. And then there's whole of this big domain here. You know, and for us Russians, spirituality may be, I don't know, jet lag or going kayaking with Arsusha, whatever. But, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, you have to go and pray 10 times a day. That really means whatever that means to you. But that internal meaning, quite often when it's lacking, that whole root gets knocked out, and it actually affects life, sometimes more important. So if I give you 5 choices, cause of heart disease: smoking, high-fat diet, low vegetable diet, chronic stress, and lack of exercise. Which one is the most important?
Stress.
Divided. Stress by a factor of 3. If you combine diabetes, smoking, and lack of exercise, it will reach their level of stress. Right? And that's a statistic. That's a well-known numbers. About 95% of all cardiovascular disease can be prevented by addressing those 5 things I mentioned.
What is an energy system balance?
That's, remember when we were talking about mitochondria? So we are not really realizing, like if you're fatigued and it's persistent in your life, that's probably here. It probably means that your own cells are unable to generate enough energy. Now that could be a secondary problem, say from sleep. Or it could be a primary problem when mitochondria is struggling. And I actually, in the clinic, have ways of measuring this. There's a way of measuring that. We actually measure Krebs cycle now. So we take the enzymes and we look at how your enzymes are cycling. And it's an insurance-covered test.
How can that be treated?
Well, you can treat it with physical activity. That's my favorite one. You can treat it with certain supplements that are specifically targeted. You actually can give somebody NADH or NAD plus intravenously. This case is very serious. And you can boost that production for a time being while you're addressing the driver, why this happened. And the driver could be, you could have toxicity that slows the mitochondria. You could have some inherited disease that mitochondria is affected. Usually that shows up before, age of 20. But most of the time, it's the same animals. It's the stress. So your system is bogged down, like your hormone system is too affected, and so the hormones are not balanced enough to allow for the mitochondria to fully function. So it's basically, if you stop looking at biochemistry and you go back at kind of a primitive way of thinking about it, all of this been answered thousands of years ago. And I'll show you why I'm completely convinced of this, even though you may not ever hear about this. Scientists always want something sexy. The reality is the most effective treatments are completely unsexy. Usually. So the modern medicine, at most, captures 20% of chronic care. So if you have a chronic illness, 80% of the time you should stay the hell out of the doctor's office, no matter what's going on. Period. There's very little reason for you to go into this healthcare system because it has no tools how to address 80% of chronic medical problems. None. Right? So things like insulin for treating of diabetes is not a treatment. It's a Band-Aid. It's not a treatment. You're never going to reverse your diabetes with insulin. Yet it's completely curable condition, both type 1 and type 2. Type 2 in my clinic, 50 to 80% cure rate, depending on patients' adherence. Type 1, 10 to 20% cure rate. Cure? Type 1, type 2 is, there's a gazillion methods. Type 1, it's usually a combination of autoimmunity and toxicity. So you have to evaluate them. Glyphosate toxicity, a lot of cases of type 1 in kids is glyphosate intoxication. There's autoimmune conditions, it's all treatable. Now it's complex. You can't simply say, take the insulin because it's so easy, just get a shot and you're done. You have to think about this very differently. You have to have a system aiming at that difference, and it's totally not. And in fact, people who try to think that way are then called charlatans and get prosecuted. Do you know the story of chelation? So, I entered the practice in 2004, 2005, just when the chelation started. They started asking this question, wait a second, there are all these doctors doing chelation. Yeah, like the old crooks, right? But like, why is nobody dying from that? So finally NIH said, okay, fine. We have to kill all those doctors, fire them, so we have to prove that they're wrong. Guess what? They actually invested $50 million to do chelation trial. Do you know the result of that trial? It was more effective than statin at reversing cardiovascular disease. Have you heard this?
No.
This has been published in 2012. 7 years ago. You've never heard of this. Now, the second trial is also looks positive.
Can you explain what it
So
is?
chelation is when you take a drug that binds something and pulls it out of your system. Usually it's targeting things like lead, mercury, calcium, whatever, heavy metals, usually, but not always. So chelation is the process of attaching one molecule to a toxin to excrete it out of the body. Okay? And in little practice, usually what it meant 20 years ago is you get put on an IV line, something is infused, something like EDTA or DMPS or whatever. And that lowers your total toxic burden of heavy metals like lead and mercury. And it's thought to be very aggressive. Well, it is sort of aggressive in a way, like most of our tools that we use in the clinic are a lot softer. That's pretty dramatic. And because of that, there's a lot of political negativity towards it. And even when I entered the practice, I was under the impression, oh my God, that's like something I will never do. And then this trial comes out, and actually a clinic that I now own, before I owned it, the original owner of the clinics was part of that trial. And the trial was positive. You can look it up. It's called TACT-1, TACT-1. And that was the trial of chelation therapy for cardiovascular disease. And nobody, they expected the trial to show negative effect, and thus they would rightly so take licenses from everybody who does chelation because it's a scam. If you're diabetic and you're doing chelation, you're increasing your chances of second heart attack by 40%. Statins do that by about 30%. And that was presented in 2012. Still, nothing happened, nothing. Except that they finally said, okay, maybe we'll do another big trial. So now there's a second TAC2 that's underway, which actually I was part of, and then I left because I said my own cardiology department at my own university refused to send me patients. And I asked why. They said, oh, that can't be true. Now, 1,500 patients in a quadruple randomized trial, 4 groups. You can't do any better than that. It was run by NIH, by a high-end researcher, and they wouldn't believe it because it doesn't fit in the paradigm. It doesn't fit in the box, so they're taking a statin because the pharmaceutical industry says. Right? So that's the reality. So
isn't somebody marketing those?
no, EDTA costs about $1 per dose, and you can buy it in Europe. It's over the counter. You can buy it right now over the counter in oral form or rectal form or whatever form. Just look it up, EDTA. It's one of the cheapest. Those of you who work in a lab probably using EDTA in a certain media for microbes. It's pretty commonly used to take out some stuff out of the media, like copper, for example.
You all sell it for half.
Yeah. So that's real. So, can we change all of us and all of our patients by prescribing lifestyle? Let's take a look at that. So I told you we're going to talk about blues. How am I doing on time? Not too slow? No, I think I'm okay. So this is what if I believe anything about future of healthcare system, I think it's a past of a healthcare system. I think it's going back to this domain. So these are the zones where in the world there are exceptional communities that show chances of living to 100 to be exceptionally high. So if you're in one of these areas, Loma Linda, California, that's Costa Rica, Sardinia, Icaria, which is Greece or Japan, your chances, especially over here, your chances of making to over 100 is something like 5 to 10 times likely that if you live in Boston, Massachusetts. Wow. well, and I don't know actually, not Boston is something general, it's average American population. Actually, I bet that Boston is probably doing better than the rest of the country. Sure. Just because all of you here listen to me and you're going to live forever. All right. So this was studied quite extensively. If you're interested in reading about it, I highly recommend this book, Original Blue Zone. Don't get the updated version, just get the original one. It's fascinating. You can actually get it also probably on Audible now. And there was a whole team. They had a big grant. They went to these areas. And what they did, they actually said, look, there has to be some common denominators as to why this is happening in this world. And so they did, in fact, prove that. And it basically came down to very, very simple, what they call Power 9 kind of rule. You know, purpose, plants, wine, family, what is that, 80% rule? Oh yeah, eat till 80% satiety, we'll come back to that. Move a lot and move naturally, right track, so your social interactions and belong. And belong is very generally, like that sense of purpose and belonging goes together. And downshift, so rest a lot. So I kind of translated for average American this way. You know, so you really have to move. Now, that doesn't mean exercise. Nobody exercises in blue zones. The gentleman on the slide, whatever, 5'6", that was cutting the grass or probably wheat, I mean, do you think he ever exercised daily in his life? He doesn't even know what that means. They move. They just do their daily chores, right? I mean, our daily chore is I get up, I make a coffee, I schlep over to the car, I get to the office, I go sit in the chair, right? I mean, I made 50 steps in there. By the time it's 5 p.m., we may have made a few thousand steps. By the time it's 5 p.m., some of those guys in Sardinia made 20,000 steps. So this whole thing that we have to exercise 30 minutes a day is a total lie. It's total nonsense. You know how they calculate that? They take an average population, they give them tiered exercises. So there will be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20, 30, 40, 60, whatever. And they say, okay, if you exercise 30 minutes or 60, you know, the outcomes are kind of similar. Maybe 60 a little better, but we really can't justify it because it's a lot more. They don't compare that to somebody moving 5 hours a day, naturally moving, walking, you know, carrying something, whatever. That's never been looked at. So all the data we're using when you go to a doctor, you've been told something about movement. It's all based on nothing. It's a thin air. Do you want to be compared to a couch potato that never moved in their life and they've been used in study as a controls? Why? Right? So, you know, a lot of the studies that we're basing our current recommendations on are really not applicable when you look at your own health. It's really difficult to translate. So this is why I think Blue Zones is the must read for everybody, even for this 2 or 3.
Are there such rare situations where all, I mean, these 9 things, you know, I figure any relatively poor village, you know, people are going to move a lot, they're going to eat a lot of vegetables, it's they're going to have like a
They don't have
church
money
every.
for wine.
Yeah,
It's actually
why it's just the specific places? Why it's like Sardinia? Why not
Because
Corsica? Why not like...
all of these things come together there. Because, you know, they can downshift. You can take some really poor village somewhere like, where were we? In Colombia? Remember we were passing from, is it Cartagena? When we were driving to the tourist part? And we were passing like those slums. It was crazy. Well, guess what? Do you think they can truly downshift and relax and have the right community and socialize effectively and be safe?
Have normal food.
Are you kidding? And have normal food? Yeah, plant-based. Yeah, they have plant-based. You know what that means? Potatoes and corn. That's not plant-based. I mean, it is plant-based, but it's not really what we're talking about, right? They're actually saying slant. It's an important word. It doesn't mean starches. It's really important, right? So in fact, high starch, high simple carb diets are probably the worst thing you can do. Second to the stress. And probably third, not second. So if you're probably better off having really good stress control with a lot of meditative practices, moving a lot and then eating shit. So you're probably better off than eating the best possible diet, not moving and having boss yelling at you every day, and you have no practice to sort of balance that off. Right? So, sounds like a lot of our lifetime. Okay, so to me, this becomes lately one of the most important factors. It's totally impractical to implement continuous caloric restrictions. It's totally practical to implement regular intermittent fasting. Now, it's interesting, there's this new approach called FMD, or fast mimicking diet. Those of you who are familiar with any longevity work, Victor Langer, kind of a big name now. So this FMD that he developed and shown, combat cancer and diabetes and all kinds of issues, it's taken from the fact that for a lot of people, this thought process is hard to, acclimate to, that you have to fast 16, 20 hours on a regular basis. It sounds a little crazy. I'll actually tell you it's not crazy, it's quite easy. But it takes about a year to get adapted to it. But if you eat certain foods at slight caloric restriction, few times, say 5 days every couple of months, that was his whole plan. So it's 5-day diet, 1,500 calories, 40% fat, 20% protein, and the rest is the complex carbs. And that sort of induces very similar state, but you don't have to practice it very regularly. You can do it 5 days out of 3 months instead of doing it like what I do, which is 4 or 5 days a week. I fast anywhere from 16 to 24 hours. Now
So
that's
I think
not
FMD
easy.
puts you into ketosis very fast.
So it takes about a year to adapt, to shift to ketosis quickly and painless.
Yeah.
So like right now, I know how I shift. I go through about half an hour of a kind of a half-fogged state, and then suddenly energy spikes after. And any of you who are any long-distance runners? Anybody who run really more than 2 hours at any point in their life? Okay, nobody. So you would know that you hit the wall. Well, that wall is when you run out of the sugar, and you have to switch to the fat, and the only way to do it is spend a little bit of time in that weird space. If you've never done it, you're gonna feel really sick. Your sugar crashes and you feel hypoglycemic. But in reality, the more you practice that, eventually you just cruise through it. You're not even noticing. So I can have a sugar of about 45 to 50 and just stand like this and talk to you, right? But it takes a lot of training because at the same time my fat burning is increasing. So I can do that because my body adapted by now to switch to fat quicker than before I started. But I was one of those people, if sugar drops, I'm on the floor, I can't even lift a finger. I was that bad. Part of it is my sugar drops quickly. So, all right, you want to show you some real fun pictures? So last summer, some of our friends went to Korea, so if you want to see places on Earth where this is actually lived, go and experience it, because it's really hard to appreciate what I'm telling you until you actually see it, and until you realize that we can all do it in our life. Literally, this is not something that is theoretical. You can do all of this, and it'll probably take you a few months to get to that. And it's not that difficult. This is probably the hardest one, right? But, before we immigrated here, we were all doing this. I mean, you all know that if you don't sleep and you want to go and get something from Russian pharmacy, you weren't getting a fucking Ambien. You were getting valerian root. Why? Well, because it works. And because it's a lot safer and cheaper, and because no patent could be applied to valerian root to make gazillion dollars, and hence the government would say, let's use that. So, so it's sort of literally going backwards. Why? Well, because guess what? Ambien doesn't work any better than valerian root. At all. Ambien doesn't work at all. There's been clear studies on that. It just only works for acute cases, but not for chronic. All right, so food as medicine. So this is, what is that?
Weed.
Weed? No, I don't know what that is. I can't, the pictures are. Anyway, no. This is heather. It's heather is verisk, the verisk remote. So this is the most expensive, the best honey. Like, you know, Manuka honey is actually not as valuable as this. So they make the heather honey there, which is amazing and extremely cheap. Like if you try to buy it in America, you're probably going to spend somewhere around $30 a pound. There, it's like $5 a pound.
It's probably fake in America.
I don't think you can even easily find it.
Yeah, I don't think you can buy it even if you want.
So this guy is 83. He's the beekeeper. So we saw this guy take. You know, you've ever seen the boxes of the framed honey with frames? They're like 40 pounds. He's like, and he like. So it's fascinating. I mean, he spent his whole life doing this. For him, lifting the 40-pound box is just daily routine. And he was saying how I'm getting a little old. Like I'm hiring somebody. So because I used to sometimes pick up 2 boxes at the same time. Now I don't want to do it. I just want to pick up 1 box. I can't pick up even one sometimes when it's full of honey. There's a little video. I don't know if it's going to work. Oh. There's no sound. There's no sound on this? Oh, well, he's basically asking him what's he doing all this, you know, and all he's saying is like, well, you know, it's all traditional. Like, this is how, you know, it's been passed to me and I'm still doing this. And then he went into this tirade saying how all this new generation, they eat McDonald's and, you know, they don't move and stuff. It was pretty funny. That's a translator. All right. It's my best geriatric joke. This is a Czech who's sleeping. You guys almost sleeping. I think I better finish up soon. Don't sleep if you don't get this. Okay, so well, they're hanging upside down, and the old one telling to the new one what is he most afraid of, incontinence.
Yeah, what that word means.
Incontinence when you pee on yourself. Okay, so I promised you we'll talk about Alzheimer's, so we will. So in my practice, a lot of proportion of population that I'm seeing are Alzheimer's. And, this is traditionally, when I was in fellowship in 2008, 8, you were sort of taught that this is not something curable, this is not treatable, you're going to die if you have it, and just get used to it, and we're just going to palliate. We're going to help you to kind of decline more comfortable. And it's a staggering, scary numbers. This is billion, this is not a million. This is correct. So, if this is not reversed or changed, we're going to be spending 10% of the more at some point than the entire healthcare system on Alzheimer's care alone. What's the budget of the United States right now? Annual budget.
4 trillion.
I think it's more like
4
10.
oh.
I think it's 10 trillion. I think the healthcare budget is 2 trillion right now.
Yeah,
It's
healthcare is 20%.
It's 20%. So this is about 10%. And this does not include, this is really important, it does not include the caregiving. This is only direct healthcare spent on the patients with Alzheimer's disease. If you say that if you have a loved one at your home and you're taking care of them, well, you're probably going to take time from work, or you may stop working altogether. It means that cost of you not working, it never counts into that number. If you add this, it's triple that number. But it's not fair to include that into the healthcare expenses because it's not. Truly, it's an indirect cost. So, and if we do nothing, about how many people we have here? Say 20, 30? So we would expect by the time we all get to 80, there's probably about 7 or 8 of us going to die with Alzheimer's right now, unless we do something. And I can actually tell you that we can do something. So why am I so passionate about this is this. When I finished geriatric fellowship in late 2007, 2008. I was asked to give a grand rounds at the DC VA hospital. That's half of our fellowship. And I was decided to talk about Alzheimer's because I felt like back then it was pretty clear already that you can implement some lifestyle changes to decrease risk. And I stumbled upon this study. This is 1995 and 1999, or in 1996. So you can't really see this because the resolution of the projector is not great. So this is Japan and United States, so on actual numbers. So if you get to age of 85, 90, about 30% of that population in those two countries is going to have Alzheimer's disease. But if you live in Okinawa, remember it's one of the blue zones, you're less than 15%. It's more than twice the difference. So I took this slide being kind of, renegade and not sort of, and I went to my teacher, to my memory mentor, and I said, Jim, Dr. Cooper, I respect him, we still communicate all the time, he's retired years ago. I'm like, Jim, you never showed me this and you never told me that this is possible. All you're telling me is like, they diagnosed Guillaume's, Seroquel recipe and send them home to die. I'm like, but explain this to me. He's like, no, I can't. I'm like, well, what do you mean you can't? You ever ask yourself why this happens? He's like, yeah, that's their lifestyle. I'm like, excuse me? So you telling me that there's lifestyle method that you know about and you're not telling the public? He's like, yeah, we all know about it. So like, all right. So, that was the beginning of kind of an eye-opening. And then about a year later, in a minute I'll show you, I had a patient, because I said, look, I can't live like this. I have to put this into practice right away. So I'll show you what happened when I did put it into practice. So, since this is a Boston public, a bunch of you I bet from MIT and Harvard, well, for sure, some of you I know that are from one of the prestigious institutions that I didn't get accepted to. So this is a very recent article. This is 2017. Those of you who know what Lancet means, you would know that Lancet Commission is probably the most important statement. It's probably more important than New England Journal of Medicine. But it was kind of a joke about Harvard because, Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, there's a little bit of a competition going on. So, but anyway, so they come up with this statement that right now, if we aggressively engage in the lifestyle prevention, we can prevent a third of Alzheimer cases. That fits very well with what I found data from more than 20 years ago, more than 30%. Right? Consistent. So, you're all sleeping, falling asleep, I know, I'm sorry, it's kind of late.
But prevention isn't the same thing as cure, right? So if you see somebody who already has Alzheimer's.
Exactly. But that's been studied. You guys just feeding me into the next slide. So this has happened already. So this is a very large Finnish trial of over 1,000 patients. They did exactly that. They took the sick population that already had existing cognitive decline, and they implemented a very comprehensive training. Diet, exercise, cognitive training, reduction of vascular controls, and they showed a pretty dramatic decrease in the reduction. Now, if you carefully look at this, it doesn't look like much at some of these other issues. But if you're a patient, so this is executive function, so this is actually what we do. The memory is important, but our day-to-day operations, paying bills, driving up, it's right here. This is a huge difference. So the reality is this has already been shown, and yet none of you ever heard about what I'm saying. Why?
But is it that they learn to live with Alzheimer's? Or so
No, they
No,
improved.
the symptoms are getting
They
better.
improved in a randomized fashion. So they took the patients who already were suffering with a cognitive impairment. Now, given that this were not advanced population, this is an early cognitive impairment. So the idea, it would be too scary, I think, for current medical world to take an advanced Alzheimer's case and say I can reverse it. But if you take pre-Alzheimer's, what's sometimes called MCI or SCI, minimal cognitive impairment, or subjective cognitive impairment, you can improve it. Now that's
you can definitely slow down.
Right. Well, that's exactly what the study has shown. So if you do this versus group of doing nothing, you're definitely improving. Now they're continuously declining, but they're declining at a different rate. That was the whole point of the study. So it's not just prevention, you can implement this already. And so this is, oh, something's missing. Oh, there. So this is a commissioner of FDA. And even that person is saying, look, we have to stop treating this chronic illness as one intervention. So the reason I really, and the multimodal approach is really the future here. So the reason I'm talking to you about Alzheimer's is simple. It's the best possible condition that I can prove to you that will never have any drug treatment or any pharmacological intervention that will be the cure. It's not possible. It makes no sense. You can't take a complex medical problem, which you'll see in a second, that has more than 30 drivers, that potential, so more than 30 causes of Alzheimer's, and somehow assume that you can give one drug, one molecule, and reverse the condition, even if you can remove the plaque. Turned out the plaque, those of you who understand what I'm saying, has nothing to do with Alzheimer's. It's a total lie for hundreds of years, for over 100 years. Plaque is a body's natural protection against the inflammation in the brain. It basically takes the inflammatome, or that molecule that causes inflammation and toxicity, and stores it away by causing the plaque around it. If you remove the plaque in human, you worsen the Alzheimer. Even though in animal model, if you remove the plaque, you make animals better. The reason is humans form the plaque a lot later. By the time you're removing the plaque, the game's over. You have to be preventing the plaque, not removing it. And that has not been ever done. So, and this is our data. So this is the guy who started this whole field in research is Dale Bredesen. This was just published a few days ago. 3 of our patients in this report. So this is the first 100 patients that had a proven reversed Alzheimer's disease. So, and I'll show you the actual program. He's at the University of California, in David Geffen School of Medicine, Box Institute, Memory Institute. So this is very complex. I don't want to really bother you since it's kind of late and you're all falling asleep. But bottom line, you have to address all of the risk factors at the same time. There's also this whole gray area of what to do with the endocannabinoid system, which I think is the next big thing in Alzheimer's. But that's a whole separate discussion. It's a very complex protocol. It involves dramatic changes in the diet, high fat, low carb, high plant-based diet, so a lot of greens and a lot of vegetables. Lots of exercise, tons of supplements, optimizing of different dysregulations, sleep hormones, and a lot of detoxification. So it's complex, it's expensive because it's complex. So all this somebody have to pay for, right? But here's the outcome, so I'll show you a few cases. So this was my first guy. I inherited him from one of the attendings who was retiring. I was covering the hospital. It's 2008. So I met him first in the hospital. Those of you who understand what this means, mini mental exam of 14 out of 30 means pretty advanced condition. It means that he will see you now, and probably in 5 minutes he will not remember who you were 5 minutes ago. Moreover, at that point, he was not being aware of his own kids' names. He would recognize there's somebody familiar because he's seen the faces over and over again, but he wouldn't be able to name them. So he came in pretty sick to the hospital, got discharged to the nursing home-like environment, and about 2 or 3 months later put on hospice because they said he's going to die in 6 months. That's when I became his attendant. So all I did is I put him on a very aggressive anti-inflammatory diet. I gave him a lot of turmeric. I gave him a lot of B vitamins. There are special forms of B vitamins. What happened to this gentleman? He lived for 10 years. And I remember until now, and still, and I have the stories from the family if you're interested, I can send you the movies. Basically what happened, he was a multimillionaire, so he was an engineer for White House. It was pretty secure financially. They moved him in a very fancy assisted living facility called Sunrise. And, I told him, he's got 6 months to live. I'm right out of fellowship, right? So I'm just, following the standard of care. And I said, well, he's got 6 months to live. That's why we put him on hospice. That's an official, you have to have about 6 months life expectancy to get on hospice. And I told to the family, well, that's good. You guys are going to probably save all the money because, So 2 years later, when he's actually totally fine, like he's stable, nothing's happening, they're like, okay, well, how many more years? I'm like, well, maybe another year. So we played that, game until he died 10 years after I first met him. And look, he never declined cognitively. When I showed this to my mentor, he's like, yeah, that sometimes happens. So I said, Jim, I don't believe you. Like, you lied to me back then. It's like, why would I believe you now? So this is when I start really thinking, this is a treatable condition. Just not the way you learned in fellowship. Drugs, of course, don't work. So, and then a couple of years later, this happened. So Larry, and I have permission to share all this, by the way, from family. So Larry was a decorated war veteran. He lived a pretty fulfilling life. A guy grew up in Texas, learned Arabic in college, just somehow became extremely proficient, became one of the most powerful CIA agents. Like, you would never guess that he's a redneck from Texas. He was extremely respected, so when he died a couple years ago, he had a 5-star general leading the funeral, like he was that respected. Anyway, so he showed up in my office. I will never forget this. His wife was my patient, so of course the wife dragged him. He would have never come. So he comes in and he had this test. He grabbed my hand. The guy is like 89 at this point. He squeezes my hand and I'm like, oh my God, if I wouldn't do my martial arts, I would have been like, So I had to evade him with Tai Chi moves, and that's when we bonded pretty well after that. So he came in early in a disease, 23 out of 30. In fact, for his age, you can arguably say this is normal, but he couldn't, he was still driving, but he couldn't drive at night anymore. He couldn't bounce the checkbook well, like wife had to take over. His friends are he had like massive people working under him at the end of the career in the early 80s. He was still actually working in the 80s. But all that kind of disappeared. He couldn't even do some basic routine, like she would tell him, go wash the clothes, and he just didn't know how to do that anymore. So, we did the full intake. Anybody knows what that is? Yeah, that's right. So, turned out that when he was in Korea, apparently I didn't know that, the Koreans are big in swordfish. So he started eating swordfish 2 or 3 times a week. So basically, after about 10 years of doing it, he became dramatically intoxicated by mercury. So this is how this story goes back to the beginning of conversation, how it links to me. This is an actual test. Now, we have very comprehensive testing capacities now that we didn't have 10 years ago. This is normal. That white line, that's Larry. That's more than 10-fold normal grade. So, and then this is what happened. I'll never forget that. So this is follow-up 2 and follow-up 3. And as that went down, Larry's life came back. His cognition went up from 23 to 28. And this is something unexpected here happened. He came back and realized he lost his entire life. Like, imagine the person who's really completely disoriented, and suddenly he knows how to drive. He understands that he sort of, cognitively was impaired and now he's not. He's got profusely depressed. His whole life was out. His his kids were fighting with his wife over the estate. He was pretty rich, like you can imagine. And so he very quickly decompensated. He had one severe infection after another, and I'm convinced that he was depressed. And then he had strokes, and just it's all deteriorated rapidly down. So after that case, it took me a while to process what happened, because I saw the change. Like, I literally saw a man disoriented, and suddenly his executive function comes back. You can imagine the effect on a provider because I didn't expect that. Like, by that point, I've heard Dale speak once. Like, Dale was just coming out with his research in public. And so when that happens around the same time, I actually asked Dale to write the chapter from my book. He didn't, because by that time he was writing his own book. I'll show you in a second. So that was, for me, earth-shattering. And since we had multiple other cases, this gentleman, this is not very striking because he didn't just, he didn't really improve, he just slightly improved. But that's stable after 2 years. Those of you who, if you were to, like, Irka may understand this, like, you would expect a decline in this time if it's true Alzheimer's. And this is shocking. So we're doing this volumetric MRIs now, and so his MRI, his brain increased double in the memory area called hippocampus. So what we're seeing is no joke. Now, this is not just me screwing up the test, although I do believe that I'm pretty good at that. It's really it's objective data. You can't really make this stuff up. It's just an MRI of the brain, standard MRI. We just use type of MRI that we're using is called, it's a special software called NeuroReader. And this are his drivers. So he had a high sugar, high lipids, high homocysteine. This is all lifestyle and supplements that normalize it. So he, interesting story, he was an executive at the government who decided that, so when he came in, he was already on disability. Because he couldn't perform his job, so he applied for long-term disability. His wife helped him. And what's really interesting that until now, he's fighting with his insurance. Because he has an official Alzheimer's diagnosis, I didn't diagnose him from a neurologist, but he's not getting worse. So they're like telling him, well, what's going on? Like, you got, and he's like,
supposed to be dead by now.
Yeah, well, not dead by now, but worse. And so every 6 months I have to write a letter to state that he still has Alzheimer's. I'm like, well, yeah, neurologist saying, why shouldn't I say different? But insurance is fighting hard, and he doesn't want to go back to work. He gets 70% of his government pay, and he's like volunteering, running marathons, and enjoying his life upstate New York, in a vacation house that he bought. Not bad, right? So, but we have we don't have a system in place how to deal with this. Like theoretically, I would say, well, he should lose his diagnosis of Alzheimer's, go back to work and, live his life, continuously following the protocol. But, I can't do that. Like, once Alzheimer's is in the chart, that's not something I can remove, right? It's a permanent diagnosis. A couple other cases. This is actually a recent case. I was telling Irene about this. This is on Monday. So this lady came in back in October because her doc sent her to me for memory poisoning. And so she's much younger. So all we did is we asked her to take out the silver fillings and stop eating tuna and other big fish. I don't want to show because we don't have a follow-up test yet for her. So we're still waiting. About 6 weeks ago, she took out the fillings and she came in on Monday. So when she first came in, she was 1930. Now she's 24. So I'm going to double, triple check that, and we're going to get her MRI to double, make sure that indeed this is improving. But she's driving again, and she's able to read. She stopped reading. Now her husband says she's reading again. So, So what does all this means is we have to get money to study this in randomized fashion. Dale went to the NIH and said, give me the money, and NIH said, there's no scientific merit in what you do. That's actually correct. But you can't study scientifically this. Did you see the whole protocol? I cannot tell you.
To do all this.
Yeah, I cannot tell you out of all of this what's important. All I know that I can practically put all this in hopes that I will address most of your drivers. And I can't predict what components of this for which person are more important than others. And that's the problem. And if I take this to NIH, they're going to say, yeah, I hear you, there's a clinical and potential critical application, but we can't study this. There's no scientific paradigm on how to research this. So all I can do in my own institution is to get an IRB exempt status right now, which is exactly what we did, and kind of collect the data and publish it soon. So in this summer, we have 30 cases right now with about 15% response rate and about 20% dropout rate. Actually, 20% dropout rate to me is amazing. But that's because the patients who are coming in willing to pay, about $10,000 a year to run the program, and they have the at-home assistance to be able to do
follow
this.
it, actually, right?
It's crazy. I try to, sometimes when I was told by some of my care team to do exercises twice a day. I catch myself in 1 week that I haven't even done it once in the past week, you know. So like, I can imagine people doing all that. But I guess the incentive is different, you know. I have a slight shoulder ache, and they lose their memory. It's a big difference. So this is some interesting future directions. You know, we're partnering with, I hope Andrew comes, Andy, because we're partnering to do some of the cognitive exercises. We already have a partner for movement. We're creating a pre-packaged meal with a food partner, because a lot of people don't want to cook a specific diet. You know, I'm a huge fan of this arm. I'm giving a big talk in the next couple of weeks, but actually I have to be very careful because feds are apparently going after everybody making these statements and literally taking licenses away. So all I'm saying, I'm just studying this for now. But I do believe that there's a possibility that it's going to be really potent. I do see some cases already that there's some positive effect. I just don't know what to make of it yet. Every single patient who comes into the program has a disturbed microbiome, so we're partnering with 2 companies, one called Genova, one called Ubiome, to do some of the research there, and I'm also using some specific probiotics. I can't really speak to this. This is going to be very interesting, because the link is there, but we don't know how to fix this yet. Like we try, in young people, I know very well how to address microbiome. Somebody past 65, it's really difficult. I think actually stool transplant will end up being probably the most effective, but that's not very practical. It's not very easy to do, and moreover, it's really hard to get the right donors. The biggest challenge is the donor. So
Yeah, you need to get it to yourself 20 years ago, right?
Well, that's easy. I mean, you know, animals, that's not a problem. The problem is because, you know, we screen a lot of stools, and a lot of people, even kids, look already disturbed. So, you know, we need donors from like third world countries, you know, from Amazonian forest tribe or something. So there's actually a project, a poop preservation project. And I think the actual main person in charge is at Harvard. So they go in different native tribes, and they're collecting their shit, literally, like to, you know, preserve it, because as a society, we lost most of the microbiome. So that's a whole fascinating conversation. So, you know, and basically the whole point, I think, we have to do better at presenting these cases, making sure that they in line with the scientific quality of case presentations. So we have a publisher in one of the large journals that's working with me right now on this. So it'll be interesting to see what they're going to say when those cases are going to start coming out in many, not 1 to 100, but the thousands. So, you know, that was a mistake generated by my nutritionist, and I felt it was like the best thing. That's my bees, by the way.
Yeah.
They did very well this winter. So those of you who donate for nonprofit, you know, thank you, and hopefully this year we'll have just as much honey, if not more. So, okay, it's pretty late, so 9:30. But whatever, I'll stick around a bit longer for questions and stuff. Anybody wants to buy a book? So the book covers most of what we discussed. It's very thorough. It's very big. It's expensive because of that. $60. The consumer version of it is now in works. We already have a contract with the same publisher, Oxford University Press. So that'll probably come out in about 18 months. That's the usual cycle. I have a professional writer, so that should be finished in 6 months, and then it takes about a year for them to get the book out into the publishing. So it'll be a lot shorter, and a lot of stuff will not be in there. I actually think that this book is written in a very easy to understand language. So, and I have the Square, so if anybody wants to buy it. I don't want to carry them home.
So did you mention Dale?
Dale
Bretton? Okay.
So there's been a lot of rebuffing recently of his work going around.
No, because I remember posting something on Facebook about calling Alzheimer, but it's not a silver bullet, it's a silver buckshot.
So the joke here is it's Bach Institute. It's
Yeah.
the name where, that's funny, where Dale...
He did like a great talk, I think, at STEM Talks.
Yeah. Yeah, so, Dale is a researcher, he's not a clinician. So what he has a financial entity that's doing this because government didn't want to give him money. I'll just bring this. Oh my, I didn't put, I'm so sorry. Let me just do something else because I realized I didn't put, somehow that slide got cut off. That's a bummer, but we'll get there in a second. So that's the book that everybody, when it comes out, that everybody should try to get. It's also on Audible. It's very complicated. Language is simple, but all the details of the protocol I was putting are there. What's very unclear in the book is how to practically implement the structure because it's so complicated and requires a lot of tests and a lot of assessments. So I think the problem to commercialize this on a large scale, that in the current healthcare model, when you don't have a standard assessment protocols, and like let's say you have a Medicare, and Medicare will only allow you to check your homocysteine once in your lifetime, and I need to do it every 3 months, it's impractical. And yeah, I understand that I don't have a specific code that I can have Medicare approved. That's why the whole program has to be cash. And maybe in 20 years, anybody familiar with Dean Ornish?
With what? Who?
Dean Ornish, you heard that name? So Dean Ornish, about 25 years ago, created a program of reversal of heart disease with diet, with basically plant-based vegetarian diet, stress reduction, and exercise. And it took him 20 years to get to the Medicare approval. So that gives you an idea. And back then, nobody would listen to him.
What about Dr. Fung? Dr. Fung, who is
I think he's doing fasting.
two books about diabetes reversible?
Yeah. So that to me is simple work because the reversal of diabetes is straightforward and easy. It doesn't require. Diabetes is typically just a couple of dysregulations. You can address them, mostly with diet and some movement. You don't have to you don't have to take supplements. You don't have to, there's not much involved. It's just mostly thinking correctly about the issue. So I think that's a high-fat diet approach. So to Mark Hyman's the same idea. Yeah, that in England they now have standard care involving those protocols, and that's, to me, it's not interesting. Partially because I've worked with a lot of patients with diabetes 10 years ago, and I know that it's relatively easy. The problem is, well, it's not a problem, it's a great thing, is that there's a large uptick in providers doing that already. Mm-hmm. So that's already not novel at all. That was novel 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think this is novel now. So this is and I do think that most of us have to engage in some parts of this. Why? Because you remember what I told you? If we do nothing, is it 30% of us, if we make it to 80, will end up with this. So.